So the Narragansett Bay Commission has already said that they're not interested in a lease deal. It's a sale or nothing. So you keep talking about these potential partners. Who are these people?
Yep, so that's a good question. So Narragansett Bay Commission, everyone knows, is your wastewater provider. In a lot of other places, wastewater providers are also drinking water providers. So that's why I think originally a sale was interesting to them, because the city's not contemplating that. Obviously, that's not necessarily a partner in this transaction. There are a number of national water managers at this point. I mean, Suez is an example. Jeff, is there other examples that you think are worth pointing out? Veolia, Aquarian. So there's a number of operators throughout the nation that do this type of work. Again, some of those operators are. Oh, sorry, I can't see.
Veolia equals Flint, Michigan.
Yeah, so some of those operators do work in other parts of the country where this has not gone well, admittedly, and so we would be through. So if I could. Most of those transactions that happened elsewhere, again, the proper controls I was talking about were not in place. So we would never enter into a transaction with any vendor unless there was a proper controls in place, and that's done through a city request for proposal process. And again, we need enabling legislation from the General Assembly, in which we would also be seeking very specific controls over what would be allowed so that there wouldn't be any type of abuse. Yep. Okay, so we have some questions about lead line replacement, which I know is a big issue because a lot of those lead line replacements have happened on the east side of Providence first. So Providence Water is in the place of doing lead line replacements throughout its network. A lot of the challenges have been met when the owner of the home also has a lead line and needs to meet the lead line where they're making those transitions. The lead line transitions would continue to occur on the same schedule they are now. Again, one of the things that happened in Flint, Michigan was because they changed their water source, the chemistry of the water system changed fundamentally and the quality was poor. And we would not be contemplating any of those things. We would continue with the lead line replacement structure that's in place now. I hope that gets at that question.
Can everybody hear me? Okay. Related to the one before the last card, I would like to hear more about what the enforcement mechanisms are for making sure that the safeties that you say are in that contract can actually be enforced. Because I think what you're saying assumes that these are good actors, and they are not good actors. Right. They have shown repeatedly over and over and over that they cannot be trusted to follow through on contracts. And what ends up eating a lot more resources is fighting with them. And I want to know how my family gets made whole when they screw it up.
So I'm happy to answer that. So for every example that you see of water operators doing a poor job, water operators are operating throughout the country and you're not hearing about it. So I just want to note that. Two, the Providence Water Supply Board is the board that oversees the operations of the Providence Water Supply staff right now. That board would remain in place. It would continue to be regulated by the PUC for rates, and it would continue to be regulated by the Department of Health for quality. So all of the regulatory structures would remain in place for if we were to enter into a long-term lease. Fundamentally, the operations of Providence Water would not change substantially. The other, I'm trying to think about anything else that would be worth emphasizing. In terms of the legal liability, obviously that's something that we would be looking at if we entered into a transaction or did a transaction. I want to just emphasize for you, there's no one at the table with us right now. So we're not contemplating with any particular partner any type of transaction. So I don't have concrete examples for you of what a contract might look like or what the provisions might be, short of trying to get legislative approval with very specific controls. So I don't have a lot of data or information to share about a particular transaction because we just are not there yet. And again, we're talking about this because, there aren't any other ideas that have come up that we've heard that are going to address this problem and not result in more catastrophic challenges in our community that we could talk more about. Hold on, I'll quickly do a a card. So how did you arrive at $400 million in value for Providence water? So basically, the $400 million value was done by an outside appraiser that values and looks at water assets throughout the country, so whether they're public or private. That value is just based upon basic appraisal, again, of the asset now. It's like the valuation of your house. It doesn't necessarily mean that that's what you sell your house at. The city's valuation doesn't necessarily dictate what you are able to get in a market as part of a transaction. So I just want to note that it's a value we're using for the sake of illustration, but it's not necessarily the value of a potential transaction.
My name is Laura Moss. I'm a resident of Providence. I just want to take a room temperature right now. How many people here are against this proposition? Raise your hands. Show of hands. Cool. How many people are for? And undecided? Cool. I just want to say I think the evidence is clear. In any reporting I have read, this has not gone well. You're also saying the same thing. What I hear you saying is that we are different. Providence is special because we all know what we're doing, because you're civil servants and you're doing the best job that you can. I just want to let you know that I hear you, but I also want to know, what do you think makes us special? We are a city of people who care, just like everyone, every place else. What makes you think that all of these problems that we read about in the news is not going to happen to us?
Yeah.
So I'm happy, I don't know if anyone else.
So I think there's a lot of things that make Providence special, but to your question, I think what is special is that we're having this conversation right now, that you have elected officials who are thinking about problems that are 10 years down the road, that are not at our doorstep, and are being strategic and thoughtful about managing our finances in a holistic way, so we don't end up in a crisis situation where we are forced to make really, really dire and tough decisions. I think we already have to make tough decisions today, but $400 million today can address the problem. $400 million in 10 years won't come close to solving the problem. So I do think what is different about what we're doing right now, what we're proposing, is that we are not yet in that crisis. In many of the communities where you see things go horribly wrong is because they are forced to basically sell to the highest bidder, or sell off their assets, cut services, raise taxes, do all those things and these things. And that is the exact situation that we're trying to avoid.
Yeah. And to that point, in many of the transactions that have gone wrong, in many of the partnerships that have been problematic, the utilities have been doing these deals because they can't afford basic infrastructure. So they're doing them because they're in such dire circumstances that they need to do a partnership without even remotely close to the kind of controls we're talking about. Because if they don't do it, they won't even be able to maintain their systems.
Sorry, I just want to clarify. Y'all are saying that because we're planning for this that it's cool?
So what we're just saying is that we're at a different point than most of the communities who have done transactions that you're referencing that have gone poorly. We are at least a decade away from any type of bankruptcy or any type of financial situation where the city might be making very quick decisions and not engaging the public. That's what we're saying.
Hi, I've lived in the city for many years, and I've also watched the government function or not. And I'm a little bit concerned about what I'm hearing because it's in direct contradiction to the legislation that the State House is considering.
It's on. Just there you go.
What you're saying is in direct contradiction to what the legislation says. It negates every one of the assurances you gave us, so it's very confusing. Could you please explain that?
Sure. So, do you want me to go through the legislation, or do you want to talk about the structure?
I mean, the legislation is just very basic enabling legislation. The legislation doesn't control control for anything. The legislation does have rate caps, so it definitely addresses rates. The legislation doesn't eliminate the Department of Health's oversight over the quality of the water. It really is just enabling Providence Water or any other water utility to enter into some kind of a partnership.
But
It's
it
very,
doesn't-
very, very basic legislation.
But it's very clear that there is no control once the partnerships are entered into.
So if it was important, so we did actually have legislation 3 years ago that did that, that was much clearer about the labor protections, but because we weren't entering into any type of transaction, it was very unclear as to why it was in legislation as opposed to an RFP or an agreement with the city. If we were to reintroduce the legislation, we're happy to put other controls in the legislation, which just enables the city to do the transaction. But the actual transaction itself is not, the legislation just enables the transaction to occur. It is not dictating all of the terms of a transaction.
That's part of the problem. It doesn't assure us of anything that you've said.
We want to reinforce that we're not even remotely close to anything happening here. There are many, many steps that would have to occur before we would be entering into any partnership. We are nowhere near. There's been no RFP. We have no bids from anyone. We haven't been meeting or negotiating with any potential operators. We are just identifying the problem that we have and the fact that it's something that absolutely requires a solution. And
issued an RFQ when you got 3 bids for it.
we did not get any bids. It was an RFQ, not an RFP. Nope. Right, they weren't bids. An RFQ is just a request for qualifications to see any operators that would like to provide information about them so that we can identify whether they would be qualified operators. But we didn't request any bids and we didn't receive any bids.
There's no scope of work because it's not an RFP. A request for qualifications, we do this a lot. So an example is we're about to do one for the 5G network in the city around internet. When we ask for people to come in and basically talk to us about, what is the technology, what are the controls in that case. In this case, it's are there any viable operators that exist nationwide. Again, we got 3 responses. It's not a scope of work. In fact, we didn't ask for anything. We just asked for basically the equivalent of a resume just to look at.
To answer what this nice lady said, if you look at section 4632.3C, it says that the PUC can't approve, reject, etc. any of these transactions.
Right, so that's specific to, that's the enabling piece of the legislation allowing for the transaction. That doesn't change their future oversight of the rates. So if you look in the legislation as well, there's a part of it that creates a cap for rates over the next 5 years after a transaction occurs, and then PUC subsequently regulates the remainder of rate increases after that. We specifically put that in there because we did get feedback that people were concerned about a company's ability to manage rates, and that was just put in to legislate some specific caps. That's, again, normally done when you actually go out to RFP and enter into an agreement. But again, the legislation is just enabling, but that was one piece that we added. If we're going to, again, continue to pursue this, if it was important to Providence residents that we put in other controls into the legislation, we're open to that. We were just putting enabling legislation for us to do the transaction. It's not actually dictating the terms of the transaction, if that makes sense. Just like there's enabling legislation for the city to create a stormwater utility, it doesn't dictate how that would be set up or with whom. It just allows it to potentially exist. That's essentially what the purpose of the legislation is.
So it seems to me, first of all, that you've already made up your mind that this is the best way. And you said in the course of your talk that it was hard to get across all the changes through the state government. And I realize that our state government is somewhat antagonistic to the needs of the city of Providence. So given all of that, there are a couple of things. First of all, we are going to lease our water supply to pay down the debt so that we can borrow more money, right? I mean, that's ultimately we're gonna get the money here, we're gonna pay this down, and we're gonna be able, because we're gonna get a better rate, to borrow more money so that we can do things to keep taxes down.
No, not necessarily.
No?
No, so I mean, so if we want to go back to this slide, so just to be clear, the city borrows on a regular basis now for roads, bridges. It's very routine, but we do have caps on how much we borrow every year because we're actually the ratio of borrowing. The ratio to borrowing and a city's budget is an important factor of whether or not you're considered a healthy city in terms, you don't want to over borrow if you don't have a good operating budget. So again, that's, the city wouldn't necessarily be using the savings from a transaction to just borrow uncontrollably. The city actually has some very specific controls around borrowing that we're held accountable to, and so it would just allow us to continue to borrow at a continuous rate to make some of the investments we need to make in schools, in sidewalks, in roads. So we don't have the ability to borrow uncontrollably as a city, and that's a safeguard that's in place in a few different places.
Okay, so you were looking for suggestions, and here are a couple. First of all, reducing taxes is, so I don't know, when I go into debt and I have credit card debt, the thing that I want to do is to pay down the credit card before I save money for other things. So the rainy day fund is a nice idea, but maybe using that money to pay it down. Second of all, you itemize 3 places where we could generate revenue from taxes that are not from citizens directly, but it's hard to get the state legislature to change. Third of all, if the city of Providence was able to actually set rates in the same way that a private corporation could, which is ultimately what's going to happen, then we could raise the rates and generate the money without actually having to sell the asset. I would tie that to any rate increase would have to be passed on to the residents of Providence so that we don't gouge the rest of the state with our rate increases. However, we all know that cities like Johnston profit off of the water from the water supply, whereas the city of Providence is not allowed to. And that's the basic problem. Now, here's another idea, which is what if the city of Providence created a new sub-entity of the city of Providence, sold the Providence water supply to itself, and then raised the rates on everybody else because the enabling legislation allows you to do that.
So those are all, that third option that you laid out is not dissimilar to the legislation the city put in the first year to the General Assembly. I want to note that Providence provides water to 60% of water users in the state, so obviously that's users outside of the city of Providence. None of those residents or mayors or political bodies have any representation as part of decision making about Providence water. Providence,
they do in the state capitol, which is where this whole thing solves.
No, right. So what I'm saying is that is potentially an option, and the legislation we put in the first year actually accomplished that. So would accomplish it if that passed. So that's one option we've definitely looked at. We'd be willing to continue to look at. In terms of the rainy day fund, the rainy day fund is right now just really a couple of $1 million. It's not enough to move the needle on the pension liability. And
every single thing you said, oh, we could do this, we could do this, but it's never going to be enough. So here's the deal. Even with that slight change of thing, it's still not enough. You lowered it down and pushed it off into the future.
It's not pushing off in the future. Every system has some liability. They are gonna, if we were at 100% funded, we would have no pension payment. There's no system that's 100% funded. Most systems have some regular payment. Most cities our size, their payments are like $20 to $30 million a year.
What's our annual payment?
Ours is around 90, and it's going to balloon to over $150 million per year. So our pension payment is outsized to the size city that we are in. So that's just a few things. So we've tried that. We would totally be open to doing that again, the third option. And then the rainy day fund, again, is at best practice 5% of the city's budget. We're not close to that, and the amount in the rainy day fund is fairly low at this point.
So I'm sorry, sir. Just one quick thing to add on.
one quick thing to add on that third option. That is something that we have explored and that we're interested in exploring. The third option, again, being instead of some transaction with an outside entity, why not petitioning the PUC to allow the Water Supply Board to earn a market rate of return, and so that that additional revenue is coming into the city. The challenge with that is that there is the looming question of who owns the Water Supply Board. And right now, Water Supply Board functions as an enterprise fund. So what that means is that it's an entire separate account from the city. The City of Providence General Fund sees $0. In fact, it's a small pilot payment, something like $800,000, but virtually nothing from Water Supply Board. So we see absolutely nothing. And if the PUC allowed the Water Supply Board to raise additional revenue, that money would go into the Providence Water Supply Board fund, but then we would squarely have to address the question of who is entitled to that additional revenue. And that's something that we could be locked in litigation for years. So that is a legitimate question. So that's why we've structured this in a way that we know that, hold on a second, sir. We know for a fact that Providence owns a certain aspect, and we're looking to lease out that aspect that we own so we can avoid that question of who owns it.
The last thing I want to be clear about is we have not made up our mind. The reason why we're having this conversation is because the last 3 pension reports that the city released point to this as an important part of a solution. It's also pointed to in our National Resource Network report. And as we've continued to look at the city's finances and then we've kind of ticked off other things on the list, this still remains. And so this won't happen if we do not get buy-in and we do not have authority to do it. I'm just going to be clear on that. So we can't and we're not moving forward unless we have those types of approvals. So we haven't made up our mind. What we're saying to you is this is the option that we've come up with, and it's quite frankly politically, or it's been an option that's been on the table for a long time. No one's wanted to have the conversation with you because it's a hard conversation. And so that's why we're having the conversation. And so I want to be clear about that because we're not, again, trying to do anything negative on behalf of the city.
Hi. First, I just want to shout out to the mayor for trying to have this conversation and juggle the baby. I'm very impressed because I have my toddler under the table with the iPad, so I totally get it. What strikes me listening to this conversation, and I completely appreciate the problem that the city is in financially, but when you talk about doing anything to our access to clean drinking water, that rightfully creates a lot of anxiety because the loss of clean drinking water source would be devastating. And the problem and the biggest hole that I see in your calculation is that no matter how many regulatory mechanisms you put into place to prevent the kinds of horrible things that could happen that everybody here is afraid of, no regulatory mechanism has any teeth without the resources to enforce it. And at the city, state, and federal level, we do not have the resources to enforce even the strongest regulatory protections that we can come up with. So unless the city is going to calculate into their budget for the water the increase that we would need to create the staff to inspect and enforce any type of regulatory protections, it's sort of meaningless.
So thank you for that. I appreciate that comment, and we hear the anxiety, we feel the anxiety. I think it's very important that we also consider the anxiety and the decisions if we do nothing and what would happen to our water supply. And that's exactly what these conversations are about. And there is a long road ahead of what happens even if the day comes when the state passes a law that allows us to do such a transaction. There's still a long road ahead of public process that any of the procurement, any of that transaction would be public. It would go through our procurement process. And we would be looking to the community and outside counsel for support in making sure we have the ability to uphold that.
And to follow up on that, if nothing else, one takeaway that we hope folks take from this is that doing nothing is not an option. We can't just do nothing. Whether it's this or something more similar to what we proposed a couple of years ago with a statewide regional, a public statewide regional water authority, we can't do nothing, or we'd be at risk of all the horrible things that we and everyone here is afraid of happening without our control.
So I guess the last piece I'll do is I'll totally validate that point. Before I came here, I worked for the Department of Environmental Management, and I watched very single-handedly what it looks like when you defund your regulatory agency. And I actually think that that's a really interesting idea, the idea of a portion, if we were ever to do this, going specifically being earmarked for staffing for enforcement. And I'll just note that that's particularly a topic near and dear to my heart as someone who's actually watched that be a major challenge. So that's actually a very helpful comment.
Can I just follow up to that for 1 second to say, at least for me personally, I would be much more interested in this conversation if you could show some of the ways in which, in order to ease some of that anxiety, show us how you vision that enforcement might look, how much it might cost, what the mechanism for it might be, and then it would be easier for us as citizens to understand whether our concerns are based in what might happen or what you're already foreseeing are the problems, rather than just saying Providence is wonderful, so it's not.
Yeah, just trust bureaucrats that you've never been able to trust in the last several decades of your life. I understand. Yeah, and so I'm writing that down, and we absolutely, if we're going to continue this conversation and continue to think about going down this road, I'll make very clear note of that next time we talk about this.
Yeah, so you talk about having the PUC be in control of rate increases, but they're also in control of National Grid's rate increases. And we know very well that National Grid continues to increase rates because National Grid is a for-profit company, and that's what will happen here too, because how else is the company going to make any money? I mean, you could say that, it's, they have bigger capacity to manage these things or whatever, but they still are going to push for rate increases, and it's going to happen, so you can't present it as if there won't actually be any cost for Providence residents, because the cost will be coming out of their water bills. And secondly, you went over pretty quickly and a little bit vaguely how, whatever we put in for taxes, that's just not going to make a big dent in this. But you didn't specify what the tax rates you had set in that analysis were, why you set them there, and why it is that we can still have very wealthy people living in Providence. Everyone here has probably seen some of their houses. We have lower property taxes than some other towns in the state. And we also have really wealthy nonprofits here like Brown University. You can set a low tax rate for them and say, we're not going to have enough taxes, but that's your choice and your decision about what you think is politically feasible. So, there are going to be costs here, and we have to look at who actually has money and who is going to be paying for the brunt of this. So I'll pass it to the next person.
On the PUC regulatory oversight, this is what they do presently with National Grid and every other utility, so that is absolutely correct. I don't know that I have much to add to that, except that National Grid right now and other utilities, private utility operators, Suez actually operates in South County. They are regulated, they are set a specific profit margin or rate of return that they are able to capture through when they make investments. But to the points earlier that Nicole made about where we see the opportunity for economies of scale and for that savings that happen, that greatly outnumbers that marginal percentage.
Right, and that's another area where we could set a very specific number or cap on that. PUC is a regulatory body, but there are other ways. If state law, for instance, sets a parameter around that, then that has to be followed. So there are ways to control for that, and I don't know how it works with National Grid, but that's definitely a possibility. And in terms of the nonprofits, the one thing I just want to emphasize, the city actually receives a very significant payment from the state every year for hosting nonprofits. It's up to 27% of their value. And then we also have individual agreements with all other nonprofits. And a lot of the nonprofits have separate corporate arms, so if they have a non-mission essential use, that's through their other arm of their entity. That state pilot payment, I'm not saying that it's, of course we want 100%, but there is no state pilot payment program anywhere else really in the nation. And so while we host a majority of landmass controlled by nonprofits, pilot is payment in lieu of taxes, excuse me. Nonprofits, certain educational nonprofits do not pay taxes in the cities that they exist. As everyone knows, we've got a bunch of educational institutions and nonprofits in the city, so a lot of our land mass is occupied by those nonprofits. So just the payment that they're giving us is in lieu of or instead of taxes, and that's a state law that is on the books, in addition to the local payments that they provide. I see a hand up. I'm going to start calling on people in the middle because I feel like our process. Do you mind if I take one in the middle and then I take you? Okay. I'm pointing right at you. Yep.
Well, I would like to. I wanted to note that you talk about. Thank you. You talk about all of the terrific things that are going to happen because this is going to be so well managed. One of the things that you said is, and I know you addressed this, you said that the Situate Reservoir, the Providence Water Supply Board, is only valued at $400 million, which, it cost $21 million to produce the reservoir 100 years ago. And if you just, I know this is just like numbers, but that's what you're talking about too, is just numbers. So if you convert that money to current dollars, it's over $500 billion. And I'm not saying, it's like, I have this great thing. Well, you have to find a buyer for it. But one of the things that you say a lot in your presentation is, we're going to do this, and we're going to do that, and we're going to control this, when you're actually putting the water supply at risk to a for-profit corporation, which we know from years and years and years of watching for-profit corporations destroy infrastructure. That's right. We all remember the Gulf of Mexico, don't we? And so why do you think they're going to behave any differently than they ever have? And also, I really want to ask why you are willing to put the water supply of the entire state at risk with climate change coming along. And they tell us water is going to be so scarce that we're going to be killing each other for it. And you guys sit here at the start. I mean, they tell us we only have 12 years left. And you're sitting here at the start of this catastrophe, selling off our water supply. Because we've got a pension problem. Oh, excuse me, I'm not even sure we're going to be alive to address that pension problem. Now, I don't think, no, but I don't think that that's a realistic response to anything you've said. I want to address the pension problem, but I really object to your going right for the water supply. That is an easy solution, because it's easy for you to sell the water supply. It's not easy to go after colleges. It's not easy to go after 1% and make them pay income tax. We want it easy, and we want to be able to great than we do. It's not going to be great. It's not going to be great.
So, a few things to address there. First, the we're going to statement, again, I'm partially painting an example of a transaction, so I'm not, again, I want to emphasize there's no one at the table with us right now. There's no particular transaction that's been approved by the General Assembly, so if I misspoke in terms of how I was presenting, I just want to be clear on that.
The only thing that you are presenting. You seem quite unwilling, not you personally, but the entire staff of the mayor, to approach or to engage in some alternative things. The people of Rhode Island have always voted for referendums. And you're telling me that the people of Rhode Island can't raise $400 million to fund this thing? I can't believe that. I just can't believe that.
So that just the comment was about kind of, I think, the state responsibility, collective responsibility for the city. Unfortunately, the only case we've seen the state really step in and address this issue is when bankruptcy occurred in Central Falls. And Central Falls still doesn't have a strong school system, doesn't have a rec center for their kids. I mean, there's some pretty dire things that have happened in Central Falls. So while we would, appreciate potentially a collaborative approach with the state, I think there's still some actions that the state has asked the city to demonstrate before we would kind of have a broader partnership, and this is one of the things that we have to continue to look at. The other piece around climate change, I don't know if Leo wants to talk about the work and the focus on climate change, but that is an issue that we very much are looking at as a coastal city and is an expert area that an area the mayor's taken leadership on. Leo could talk more about, but we're not neglecting actions related to climate resiliency in light of this bigger challenge. Okay, I think I'm going to move over here. That's okay?
All right, thank you. I was a state employee in Massachusetts in the 60s. We had a gigantic unfunded pension liability in Massachusetts, and no one talked about putting.
Could you speak a little closer to the microphone?
Okay. We had a massive unfunded pension liability in Massachusetts. I was a state employee at the time. When that issue reached Governor Dukakis, there was no talk about putting the Quabbin out for lease. He treated it as a pension liability problem. He pulled together the state, the cities, the counties, and they moved toward a common pension system, so they had real economies of scale in the pension system. I think this is an incredible plan, but they're relying on our natural resources to solve a pension problem. And it did take years to work its way out of the pension problem in Massachusetts, but now Prime is one of the most solid pension systems in the United States.
Yeah, so that's a great point. So what you're talking about pension reform, and the challenge, the challenge we've had is a lot of, everyone probably knows about the state's pension reform. Part of that pension reform was going to a defined benefit, defined contribution plan that right now the treasurer implements. That's definitely something we've looked at and is a possibility. The challenges are, we're in the middle of defending the pension reform that occurred in 2012. In fact, we're, I think at Supreme Court right now defending, we had a number of retirees who appealed. And so with that appeal, we cannot bring further pension reform before the courts while we're continuing to defend that appeal. And so one of the things that's, I find kind of interesting is once you're no longer in a bargaining unit, like if we're negotiating with a union and 58% of the union like it and 42 don't, the 58 win, right? And that's the union agreement we have. Retirees, any retiree can come to the table and sue the city if we did pension reform. There's no 50% majority rules. Any number of retirees can come in and sue the city. So it's just, obviously there are definitely ways to combat that. We're having a major discussion about that, and the National Resource Network plan talks about steps to get there. But because we're currently defending our pension reform that happened in 2012, we do have some constraints on what we're able to do next and on a timeline.
Massachusetts did is they did a complete structural reform. They changed government structures. So a lot of those contracts went away.
Yeah.
In fact, entire counties went away in terms of the services they were providing. Because the state was able to explain to the populace, you either do this and you have a pension system, or you have none.
Right, right, yeah.
So, to me, I think the people of Rhode Island would truly understand if the governor explained that structural reform was necessary, not a city by city. The problem here is that Providence gets stuck in the position of being a city-state, and we are just a city. The governor really has to come in here and explain to the state that structural reform is necessary.
Yeah, and I think we agree with that, and then looking also beyond pension reform, but also looking at water resources more broadly, we do believe there needs to be a broader discussion about water management at the state level as well, and we would like to participate in that broader process.
Yeah, I think you had your hand. Thank you. So part of my life I've been in the high-tech world. And when I saw the $400 million valuation, I thought, oh, what's the revenue? Because venture capitalists look at high-tech startups that are growing really fast. And they say, oh, they're making $10 million, they're worth about $50 million. And so you can get about 5 times revenue for your valuation. That's pretty good. That's really good for a high-growth startup. Providence Water is not a high-growth startup. It makes approximately $70 million per year. In 2017, it was 71.7 million. So you're talking about a 5.5 to 6x multiple on revenue for this entity. So I thought that number doesn't make any sense. What are the other moving parts? So you're making about 72 million in revenue. You've got about $56 million in expenses. And so I thought, well, gee, what if they just raise the rates 5%? Because I don't think we can sustain much more than a 5% rate increase. But that would be okay to solve a big problem. So that gets us about $3.6 million a year. And you could raise the rates 5%, or maybe you could cut the cost 5%, cutting your costs from, what, 56 to like $53 million a year, which would be pretty good. I think it's pretty hard to cut your costs because you got union workers and you're committing to keeping them, right? But at 5%, you got $3.6 million a year. That's like $160 million over 50 years. It's only worth $36 million, okay? So in a fairly conservative scenario, this deal is worth $36 million, not $400 million. So what does it take to get to $400 million? You have to produce $32.7 million in expense savings or revenue increases. You can't cut your ways to that, and you can't increase the rates to get to that. So where I'm really nervous about this deal is I think we're spending a lot of time trying to make a deal that could only net $40 million, or in a really sunny day, $80 million, but not anything that's near what you think is required to help plug the $900 million unfunded liability, or the other liability, which is the $1.2 billion OPEB that nobody seems to talk about. So if you could sort of comment on what the real valuation is, not what some people came in and said. I don't know how you come to 400 million.
That's a very good question. So the valuation of 400 plus million, that was a valuation of only the pipes on the ground. So it wasn't a valuation of the revenue stream of the water system.
Right.
That's a very good point.
And the land. You're not selling that.
Right, exactly.
So it wasn't based on revenue.
Right, it was based upon the infrastructure, so yeah.
Right, so unless you take the pipes out of the ground and sell them to a neighboring town, you're not getting $400 million.
So I don't know how to further explain it, but
there's no.
I mean, this didn't come out of thin air. We've had outside counsel that has experience dealing with infrastructure partnerships all over the country, abroad. So again, and these numbers are just rough. You talk about a transaction. There is no transaction. We're just modeling a transaction.
What Mayor just said is right. It's the pipes in the ground that are worth 400 million. It's the water in the basin. It's the land in Situate. So please provide a real answer.
Now that's a legitimate question.
Question of the day.
Yep. And so where does the valuation come from? So as Nicole has mentioned a number of times, there is no transaction in place right now. And this only makes sense to us, so just on a financial standpoint, it only makes sense for us if it nets us $300, $400, maybe $500 million. It very well might be the case that if this goes forward, right, if we get state enabling legislation, if we go through an RFP, if we get bids back, I mean, it's very possible that the bids come back at 100 million, 50 million, 150 million, not enough to solve our problem. So that's a very legit.
I'm going to take a few more questions. I just want to be mindful that it's close to 7:30, and we only booked this room for that amount of time, and then the school needs to close up. But I'm trying to figure out where our next question is back there. Okay.
Hi, so I want to ask a question about accountability because there's been a lot of discussion about partnerships, but a private corporation is only accountable to its shareholders. That's right. And the PUC is appointed by the governor, so the PUC representatives are not democratically elected by the residents of Providence. So we're going to be in a situation where there's no accountability. If the water system is monetized such that a private corporation, which has the ability to lobby the governor and lobby for rate hikes, is the entity that's controlling our water. So I want to know how we can make sure that there's some kind of accountability.
So, yeah, good point. So just to, the PUC at this point regulates rates. There's also Department of Health, but one of the bills that we put in the first year actually created a new board, basically a new authority that had representation from all the cities and towns that are served by Providence Water. So that's one way, for instance, to create local accountability that isn't necessarily subject to the state or the governor. The other idea that came up around enforcement, I still think is a very, very solid, good one. A lot of the challenge around deals around the country that were alluded to is around that enforcement piece. There are actually decent protections in place for water quality and for oversight. It's just sometimes an enforcement challenge because government doesn't always fund those functions well. So I actually think that would be one way to kind of address that issue as well. Leah, I don't know if you have any other pieces to add?
No, I was just going to suggest so we get to everyone's questions. I know there's still a lot of hands up in the air. If we do a speed round of questions and we'll address all of them so we at least get to hear everyone. Does that work? So if folks want to put your hands up high and we'll do all of them in a row and we'll take notes and address them all together to be a little bit more efficient with time. Maybe we'll go right to left. Yeah, in the back. Go ahead. Yeah, just start. Go.
You mentioned one of the other options was a regionally controlled board, and as a big believer in deep democracy, I'm wondering, it just seems like this has been y'all have been very thoughtful about this process and have given this idea a lot of energy. I'm wondering, what are the obstacles to giving that regional board the same amount of energy? And if we can move in that direction, how can I, as someone, a resident of Providence all my life, support that process? And getting a regional board that, to remove the burden of sustaining this entity as Providence, how can you share the burden, but also increase the accountability aspect and input from the local community?
Hi, Bob Bozakowski. I work in the water business for 20 years. And a regional water authority could transfer the operations of Providence Water to that authority. And it would function as a nonprofit. Leasing it to a private company, the PUC allows a % profit to be taken, which would be reflected in your rates. It would also protect the water system from bankruptcy Providence were to go that route. The legislation that's submitted, I know they said it's enabling legislation, but the legislation that should be submitted should be very specific. It should name the entity, it should name the transfer, it should name the terms. I'm not one for vagueness. I also read the National Resource Network report. We're concerned about 1,100 retirees currently seeking benefits, and it's dragging the city down. I've looked into bankruptcy. Okay, East Providence, Central Falls, Stockton, California, property values haven't suffered. I'm not afraid of bankruptcy.
Do people mind shouting?
I can speak up, so I don't need that. Give it to someone else. I have a few things. Number 4 on your sheet here kind of has me worried. It says, if proactive steps are not taken now, the reliability and safety of the Providence water will be at risk. That is a scary thought, number 1. Number 2, I think you should have more than 3 of these public presentations, because obviously you have a stack of papers this high up there and you're not going to answer these questions. And then I wanted to just let you know that you have troll companies searching for cities like Providence who need the cash, and you need to be concerned about them. That's all I have to say. Thank you.
Michael. I just said when the council already suggested selling Providence water, I would fight to the death. I'm getting closer. So
We can't hear. You need
it.
You're getting the mic.
So the question is, you've been doing research across the country, trying to figure out. You've done research across the country, trying to figure out what are some of the pitfalls of contracts with these outside companies. What companies have you found who have been doing a good partnership with cities? Have you found any?
No.
They're not answering now.
They're not answering. They're just going around.
So if anyone has a question, but you guys want to form a line behind me just so we can do this super fast? I'll start with you, sir.
I want to echo what the brother from Silicon Valley said, that I don't think the numbers add up. I looked at the same numbers, he was citing the same numbers I was, you talked about it the other day. I don't think that worked. I think this regional authority really needs to be the first discussion rather than this discussion. I think that that's the discussion that you should be having now, is the regional authority, rather than this one, which clearly the public is not buying. Third, if you come up with the enabling legislation and then you do a deal, will you let the people of the city vote on it?
First, I'd like to say thank you to all of you who are working so hard for the future of Providence. You're being very proactive, and I know it's not easy to do. So thank you to the not easy. Just a quick question relative to pension reform. I'd just be interested in what the average age of the pensioners that you are dealing with. I'm sure your actuary folks have looked at that, but it's a question.
Hello? Hello? Okay. So years ago, the city decided that it would make more sense for private companies to handle things like the streetlights and garbage and things like that. And just recently we realized that it's actually cheaper for us to pay for our own electricity for those streetlights, because we had the power to say what kind of light bulbs were used and to cut down the amount of money that we needed to pay to a utility. So I don't see how taking something as essential that we need as water, something that is important to the lives of every person in the city, and every child and every person going on to, as long as Providence is a city, I don't see how we can justify selling this particular asset off for one-time fix for something that it's just irresponsible to our future.
Hi, my name is James Crowley. I'm here with Conservation Law Foundation, which is an environmental nonprofit. And I just want to very quickly voice a couple of concerns we have about the proposal. First, we're very concerned about the removal of oversight by the PUC, even if it's only temporary. The whole idea behind public utility is that you sanction a monopoly in exchange for oversight. If you take away the oversight, you take away the protection for ratepayers. Because the ratepayers are at risk here, we think it's worth noting that the ratepayers are the ones who are primarily responsible for paying for the assets, and as was alluded to, arguably own the assets. Because the ratepayers who pay for the assets, they aren't the ones who will benefit from the sale, that's troubling. And as the PUC has argued, they would be paying for the benefits a second time, arguably the assets. We're also concerned about the development of the land in the Situate Reservoir watershed. Under the current system, we feel like it's been pretty well protected, which in turn protects the water. But we're concerned that a buyer will see development of the land around the reservoir as an opportunity to profit off the investment. So we would just encourage proponents to address the risk to the ratepayers in the watershed.
I think my biggest question is how you would oversee, and the regulatory aspect is very important. You should be prepared for that before you get this in motion. But how you would oversee the chemicals that are used or the materials that are used for the water treatment, that's the huge danger when you're using strong, cheap ammonias, which they're going to be cutting costs for those kinds of materials. So those strong, cheap ammonias are what dissolve lead in our old pipes, and so that's how that lead gets in bath water and all the water that we depend on. So how are you going to oversee the materials that are used and make sure that they're as high of quality as we're using now? And as it is, we're already using really strong ammonias.
So I have two observations to make. The first one concerns how money gets made in this process. And there's generally three ways that can happen, one of which the last question referred to by cutting costs generally in ways that are problematic. The second we've already discussed, which is the increasing in rates, which of course is just a new kind of tax. It's just a regressive tax on the poorest instead of a progressive tax on the richest. And finally, cost cutting can occur through this idea of economies of scale. However, economies of scale usually occur by reducing staff. And the argument is that staff aren't getting reduced, so it's sort of hard to see how economies of scale would happen other than on the margins by like software purchases or something. The other observation is a little more complicated, but it has to do with the fact that the plan that goes the furthest to address the unfunded liability, according to the model presented, is one with a large upfront payment. But that is also a model that gives us the least ability to actually administer, regulate, and protect our water, because if something goes wrong, the only way to terminate the lease would involve actually paying back that body, right? So basically we would be saying, either we have to give back all our benefits, or you can run amok. Whereas a process where there are ongoing payments is one where you can terminate a lease safely, but that's not one that actually resolves the problem in the way you've laid it out. So to me, the numbers here are not adding up to the ultimate goal, and thus, if they're only going to be biting at the margins, why not do the other things that involve biting at the margins and don't risk our water?
I just want to say absolutely not. I do not believe in this one bit. I think that you're asking us to support enabling legislation without having any idea of what the terms will be. And I think that's a terrible way for the public to negotiate any deal, because we own this water. This is our water. And you're representing us in this transaction. The next thing I want to say is you're also asking us to trust you to be more sophisticated than, I don't know, 50% of the people who have made a deal like this, who have failed. The risk for us is very high. And we don't know if we enable this legislation, even if this administration is going to be around to make the deal. It could be a whole nother administration by the time a deal like this even came around. So how do we trust, I don't know, some other administration in the future is what you're asking us. And I'm sorry, but I cannot support this one bit. Thank you.
I just want to say 3 days. That's the amount of days that I've heard a person can live without a clean water source. So as dire as the pension situation is that you're presenting, this is a critical situation. And what I've not heard today are specifics on anything. You're asking us to buy into a promise that you're going to do better than what the other states have done, a promise that you're going to have controls in place, a promise that you're going to enforce. Like you, I work for the state in regulatory compliance. So I've been behind the curtain. And I see what happens and does not happen unless you hold people accountable. So many of the sentiments have already been expressed. Very specific enabling legislation, very specific controls, very specific reporting measures and enforcement and inspections. And I'd like to hear that from you today. What do you plan to do? I understand there's not a deal on the table, but you must by now have some idea of what you would like that to look like. And if you do, I'd like to hear it. And if you don't, then I think this conversation is premature, or you're not ready to share the details, which is very concerning. And so I absolutely say no. You have not given one scintilla of evidence from my perspective why this would be a good deal and why I would say yes.